Hi, I am Monica Ahens Madden with IMakeFOSS, and I am here with uh, this week's, this week's
It's okay.
curator. This week's curator. It has been a long week, and it is only Tuesday. N- Uh,
I know the feeling
I
extremely
know.
well.
I know but I am here with Neal Gompa, who is an Open SUSE board member and is also a member of the Fedora Engineering Steering Committee. So, as many of us in open source, you wear many hats, which I didn't even mean to make a pun there, but I totally
Yeah.
did. So, Neal, it is great to have you, and especially as someone who just really has made such a commitment to this and is really into helping out new contributors and community members. We're super happy to have you.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, so obligatory question first.
Of
So
course.
all of us, like various superheroes and or villains, have origin stories
Right.
about how we got into Linux. And I love that yours involves a library. So can you tell us about that? Just makes me super happy.
So, a little bit of, some context there. So, back in the days when I got started with Linux, the internet wasn't quite so prevalent or accessible back then. So, I had dial-up internet service, but if you were in that time period where dial-up internet service was the norm, you weren't going to download a Linux distribution that way.
It might take a couple days.
Days is being nice. It would
Yeah.
probably take a few months. I don't know if I want to download a 700 megabyte image or four 700 megabyte images in this case at what was it? A whopping 17 kilobytes a second. Yeah, no,
Yup.
I'm not doing that. Not doing that. That's like downloading a DVD worth of content at 17 kilobytes a second takes a long time. And that's if it stays running the whole time. And never
Oh.
mind the phone bill.
Oh
The
yeah.
phone bill, because you're still paying per minute on top of paying the access. So
Yeah.
that's not fun.
Yep.
But so that's the context there for why. And I at the time at where I lived at the time, there was a public library that actually offered computer labs for both adults and children. And in the adult computer lab was below ground because it was a lot bigger and there what else to do. But just above where the entrance to the computer lab was, it was all of the IT books, so books about computer
Logical.
technology and all those sorts of things. And those books included like guides for how to learn Unix, Solaris, Windows NT, that sort of thing. Remember, this is 2001, 2002.
Mhm.
So we're looking. So from that time frame, Arch Linux and Gen 2, those are brand new projects. Nobody had ever heard of them yet.
Wow.
Fedora didn't exist yet. Uh,
Different
Mandriva
world.
was Mandriva. Mandriva didn't exist either. Magia, never mind that. That didn't exist. It was Mandrake Linux still. Yellow Dog was still around. Debian had only just released the app tool for its package manager. It was so new.
Wow.
Like
There's gonna be a
this is
whole generation of people listening to this going, "What?" Yeah.
yeah. So this is the world that I'm entering Linux in. In this world, we didn't have it wasn't commonplace for dependency resolving package managers. That thing that we take for granted now, like Yum and DNF,
Oh my goodness,
app,
yes.
those things were brand new. They weren't really common yet. Um, and installing Linux generally was considered quite difficult. Most Linux distributions at the time made their business to make installation simpler. So, like a big part of their engineering, SUSE in particular, the big part of their engineering was around the YAS tool, yet another setup tool is what it actually stands for. And that, yeah, I know. But Yast was, you know, the bread and butter. And Mandrake Linux had the Mandrake Control Center, which offered a wide gamut of easy to use ways to configure various parts of the system. A way to configure easily wide range of system functionality post installation. So like this is the world that we're in. But this is also the same world where nobody could easily figure out anything, and things like, you know, searching on the internet for stuff was relatively difficult because knowledge wasn't quite everywhere for all this thing. It wasn't quite so commonplace. So this is the world. This is the world. This is the setting. And I was interested in learning more about programming and doing more advanced things with my computer. At the time, I had a hand-me-down workstation that was running Windows 98 second edition on it. And I'd actually I'd recently, the family had gotten a compact Presario computer with Windows XP on it. So that's where I was, and I wanted to do more. I wanted to actually explore and do something interesting. I wanted to take kind of this next step in software and in computers that I felt I wasn't able to do with what I knew and what I could discover in my current environment. And as always, and back then I didn't really have many friends. I was a fairly lonely child. And so I often was in the library mainly to kind of get away from that. I would play online games and stuff on the computer labs. I would check out video games, educational video games from the library, that sort of thing. And at one point, this one time I went into there was no games to check out, and the children's computer lab that was full of games on them was full.
Of course.
And I didn't have an adult, or my parents specifically, to come and let me into the adult computer lab. And at the time, they didn't really know me well enough to say, okay, you can just go in, we trust you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was stuck doing basically nothing. And so I went down to the area where the computer books were. And I found, this book, I think it was a Sam's Publishing book about teaching yourself Red Hat Linux in like 24 hours or something like that. I forget what the title was, but that book included a copy of Red Hat Linux on it. It was the wrong version of Red Hat Linux in the book because, people stole CDs and stuff, and getting replacements was difficult and whatever.
Yeah.
But it had a copy of Red Hat Linux 6.2. Now, Red Hat Linux 6.2 is interesting because Red Hat Linux 6, if I remember correctly, was the first version of Red Hat Linux, the original Red Hat Linux, before Red Hat Enterprise Linux, before Fedora, to include a graphical installer, Anaconda. The installer that we know today, that has existed for 20-odd years, was brand new back then. And this is before Yum was in Red Hat Linux. They didn't have that yet. Mandrake had only come out just a couple of years before. And they, at the same time as Debian introducing apt, introduced their own version of it called the User RPM tool, or URPM, with the URPMI, as some old-time Mandriva people would call it. That tool, I don't know the exact timelines and dates, but I believe it actually arrived on the scene 1 month before Debian's apt tool did.
Wow.
So the concept was pioneered by both Debian and Mandrake back then, and a lot of people don't know that it actually happened at the same time for both the RPM and Debian ecosystems. But I didn't know any of these things. That
would come later. That would come much later.
That came later. All I knew was that I got this copy of Red Hat Linux in a book, and I immediately wanted to try it out. And it was mentioned in the book that I could do something kind of clever. I could install the bootloader on a floppy disk instead of on the hard drive. So I could have it as a secret operating system on my computer. Yeah, this is like, I think 12-year-old me was very, very enamored with the idea of having a secret computer set up. So I installed Red Hat Linux onto a second partition on the hard drive. I had a copy of Partition Magic, which I used to shrink the volume so I could make room for it. And then I told the installer to put Lilo, the Linux loader. We didn't have Grub yet. Lilo. This is
People might be going and looking these terms up, but good. It's your origin story and some, some really good historical context here.
Yeah. Yeah. So I put Lilo and a copy, I think it was 2.2 or 2.4, I think was the Linux kernel version. I forget exactly which one. But the Linux kernel was small enough to fit on a 1.44 megabyte floppy disk along with a bootloader. So that's where it went. So I put the kernel and the bootloader on a floppy disk, and the rest of it lived on the hard drive. And so whenever I wanted to boot into Linux, I would put my secret floppy disk into the computer and boot from it instead, and it would bring up the fully themed Red Hat Linux Lilo theme, and it would just let me select that. And if it wasn't present, it would boot into Windows 98 or Windows XP, as I had later. And so that's how I proceeded to kind of try to do stuff that was in the book, and I broke my computer multiple times this way.
Yeah.
Again, secret Linux partition.
Yeah.
Nobody else really noticed, but I was doing all this stuff, and this went on with me starting with Red Hat Linux 6, and then moving on to 7 and 8, and then finally Red Hat Linux 9, which was the last of the Red Hat Linux line. I actually held off and didn't move to Fedora right away because at the same time that I had discovered Fedora in 2004 and decided I was going to take a look at it, another young new project had started, Ubuntu.
Yes, just about that at time.
Right. So Mark Shuttleworth had gathered his 12 favorite Debian developers and brought them together to create a new derivative of Debian with a couple of goals. Use Python to write all the tools, make the distribution easy to install and use, and those two goals, and combined with the third one, bring it to everyone. And so that appealed for me. Like Ubuntu used to have the slogan, Linux for human beings. Right. And the logo, I don't know if Canonical still has this on their website, but the Ubuntu logo used to be called the Circle of Friends.
It's still on there. So
yeah, like that, this is the world where I step into. And I wound up at the same time moving my Red Hat Linux system to Fedora. I actually also started using Ubuntu. So I used Fedora and Ubuntu in parallel. So I started at 4.10, didn't install properly on my system, so I skipped it. But 5.04, Breezy Badger. That was my first Ubuntu release.
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that my husband, his first was Hardy Heron. So.
Oh, 8.04. Yes. Mm-hmm. See, I remember them.
Someday when we all get back together, we'll do an Ubuntu or just general like code names for releases, and we'll have it be a pub quiz, and you all will clean up.
For sure. But the best part was the first long-term supported release of Ubuntu was the only version of Ubuntu to be late, was also the only version of Ubuntu to be released on my birthday in my time.
Oh.
So Ubuntu 6.06, Dapper Drake was actually, so on my side of the pond, so they released it on June 6th in the UK, was still June 5th in the US.
You have my mom's birthday. That's awesome.
So Ubuntu 6.06 I basically got my hands on it on my birthday in 2006.
That's a good
present.
present.
I immediately replaced everything with that, except for my main computer, which was my very powerful, like, I'm going to do the hackers thing kind of computer.
Get your
Basically,
hoodie, turn down the
yeah,
lights.
yeah. So my main machine where I did all the crazy stuff remained Fedora for basically the entire time. But like all of my other machines, which switched over to Ubuntu with 606, and I followed it to 610, 704, 710, 804. 704 was actually one of my favorites. Feisty Fawn. That one was, I think that was the release that introduced the more the orange tinted, the softer colors, the broader things, and the nicer, the much more appealing look and feel.
Yeah. There were also a lot of browns. We did, there was last year, the Ubuntu Twitter a account did a bracket competition with the wallpapers for for the various releases. And yeah, and we saw that's like, oh my gosh, there was a lot of brown back in the early days. So
yeah, no, brown stuck around for like what, 2 years, I think. Yeah, and then they switched to orange for 3. And then somewhere along the line, I don't get where it happened, they decided purple was their color.
yeah,
I think that was when they decided that Canonical was going to get a corporate color. And
yeah,
then
which
and
is
then Ubuntu switched to that.
yeah, because now it's kind of like the Clemson, Virginia Tech colors, and as a Bama fan, I'm kind of like, why? It's like so much orange, and it's bad because if you
I'm an MS State alum. So like
oh,
I
Hail
like red.
State. Actually, I was saying that their color's a little close to
It's
maroon.
close to yours. Yeah, the
Saying,
official color is maroon.
yeah. So
So yeah, yeah.
I know
But
we
I'm
have way
always
too
a
many
fan of
reds.
reds.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a lot of reds. But so around this time when that happens, I get very proficient with Ubuntu and Fedora as my distributions. But in 2011, Ubuntu makes the change to Unity, and so I actually made the leap with them to Unity, and I was okay with it. What the straw that broke the camel's back for me was I went through 3 successive upgrades, and every single upgrade broke. And I got to the point where I got frustrated with continuing to use Ubuntu because I came to expect an easy experience. And just because I know how to do all the things doesn't mean I want to do them.
Yeah.
And then I decided to distro hop, and that's where I get my breadth of experience with all the different ones. Now, roll back a few years, back in 2007 or so, 7, 6. So in 2007, I became a Fedora contributed my first package.
So,
But also that same year, I signed up for a Novell account to join the Open SUSE project.
well, so what made you? I mean, you had been using this, these various distros for a while. Was there something specific that made you just go, okay, I've been a user, now I want to jump to this extra level here?
Oh, yeah. So it's funny because it's really simple. I just wanted to to have a piece of software on my computer that wasn't available. So when I was doing this sort of thing back in 2006, yeah, I was starting to rip my DVD collection onto my computer and put it on a network share because I was building out a media center PC. And the media center PC server was running Fedora because that's what I preferred to use for that system. I also felt that Fedora had, with the fresher stack and the more advanced graphics stuff, and at the time I think we had just introduced Codec Buddy and a few other things, I felt it was easier to use it as a media center than any of the other options at the time. And so that's what I went with. And there was I wanted to have all the videos in a free format. And at the time, the only free format was the OGG formats, Theora and Vorbis. And that was the starting point. It was like, how do I do this? And then I found this tool on the internet called OGG Convert. And what it did was it used GStreamer to convert from anything to free formats. Initially, just OGG, Theora, and Vorbis, but later they added WebM support. The tool is dead now. It's been dead for years, but back then it was actively developed, and that guy already produced an Ubuntu thing through the PPA system,
Mm-hmm.
but nothing for Fedora. And I asked him, and he tried to make an RPM, and it was bad, and it didn't work. And so I made one. I figured, you know what? I've made Windows installers. I know how to, I've done this before. It can't be that bad. It was kind of bad. It wasn't terrible, but it was kind of bad. People don't know how good they got it now with how packaging software is a lot easier now than it was, almost 50
Oh,
years
I
ago.
know. Yeah, just don't say it. It just, yeah.
It, was- it
It's
was
like,
bad
it
then.
was last year. Oh, wait, no, it's been 15 years. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Mm-hmm.
So I did that, and I went through the process and the package review stuff, and I got a mentor out of that. Brian Pepple, in the Fedora Extras project. So back then, Fedora wasn't a unified project. There was Fedora Core and Fedora Extras. The Core Extras merge hadn't happened yet. It actually happened just after I joined. So like, I didn't really have to experience the split, but it was actually there when I had started, going through this process. But Brian Pepple taught me how to do it, and he mentored me on IRC, guided me through trying to do it the right way, and responded to me with feedback in the Bugzilla bug where we were doing the package review, and that went extraordinarily well. And that experience was amazing, and I'll cherish it because that experience is, what I try to impart to others when I'm trying to help them get involved. Like, having that path made someone who didn't know anything about anything able to become successful in that. And that was actually quite rare in open source projects even back then. So I
Mm-hmm.
had an Ubuntu account. I had a Launchpad account since 2005. I created one shortly after starting to use Ubuntu. I used to be a heavy participant in the Ubuntu forums, but when I ever tried to like give feedback or work with the developers to try to help in those, the paper cuts initiatives that they used to run year
Mm-hmm.
after year and that sort of thing, I used to get rebuffed, and it used to be, people would have no patience for me. They would not try to reach out and help me in that way, and that soured me towards, contributing to Ubuntu back in those days. And in Open SUSE, um, their community was, to be frank, very rude. They were
Mm.
German, but they were very rude. Uh, and back then it was just I couldn't deal with it. And on top of that, it used to be a lot less global. So like the time
Mm-hmm.
zone stuff mattered a lot more back then.
Yeah, which, oh, I mean, it's already kind of difficult now, but I can't imagine how much worse that would have
Right,
been.
and I was a middle schooler. I didn't know.
Yeah, God,
My
yeah,
my free time was so much smaller than it is now. So I was
yeah.
a middle schooler doing all of this, and I couldn't get successful no matter how much I tried until in Fedora. If that experience in Fedora hadn't happened, I don't think I would have made the change to becoming a contributor. But I
Yeah.
needed it. I did it because I wanted to solve a problem that I had, and it was easy to solve that problem, and so I did.
Hmm.
And slowly that's how I went from doing that to holding on to a couple of other packages. I used to be, Avant Window Navigator, I think, was another package I maintained for a short period of time. There was a few others here and there, and from there just kind of spiraled out. And I got involved in Fedora very strongly because that community nurtured it for me, where others wouldn't. Ubuntu wouldn't, Debian wouldn't, the SUSE community wouldn't. And back then, it was actually really hard to find a friendly community. Nowadays, people recognize the value of a friendly community and they try.
Hmm.
But back then, that wasn't really normal. I'm
Yeah.
sure people tried, but it wasn't like intrinsically understood that this was something that needed to be done.
Yeah, and it's when you talked about having that mentor who helped you kind of overcome that gap and realize these, what the answer to your problem was and actually put it into practice and help you do it on your own. And it's something that is so absolutely key for not only Linux distributions, but other open source projects. And thankfully, I think we're realizing the value of mentorship and how if we want them to be healthier places, then that's one of the necessary components. And it's just trying to convince people that, and I think that this was something in a previous interview that you said really well, that we're still tending to think that development and packaging are the primary ways that you
Sure.
contribute. But mentoring and onboarding and documentation, that those are, and all of those other non-code ways are just as vital.
So it's interesting that you bring that up because earlier today I had a conversation with someone, and they brought up this interesting web post that talked about, you know, uh, how uh, how about burnout and all these sorts of things, and in the community, in the open source communities, and it was easy for me to think about this, and I reflected on it. It's like, and that post made the interesting point that the change to GitHub turned all of us into what was it, performers. Basically, we were expected to do things at the behest of everyone else, regardless of what we may have felt. Um, and I reflected on this, and I found this interesting because that wasn't the world that I entered, but it is the world
Hmm.
that I live in now. And I think, I don't know this for certain. My theory is that we can correlate this with the replacement of SourceForge with GitHub, because there was a clear philosophical difference between SourceForge, or as some people might call it, Source Forget these days, to allude to the projects that have long since been forgotten that still live there. Um, but SourceForge and GitHub differed in how they presented project management. So SourceForge was a very much a give you all the tools to make your community your own, your project your own. That that included things like having mailing lists, issue tracking, version control, code review systems, CDN, the whole works, and it was all up to you how you wanted all of these pieces to work. Um, GitHub, when it was introduced, only offered issue tracking and version control with patch submission. And something that kind of happened with that was the change in the dynamic for people to get invested and participatory in projects, to basically being either pulling or pushing, like consuming
Hmm.
or strictly producing and just kind of leaving it out. The emotional attachment, the emotional investment into projects that made a lot of projects in the 90s and the early 2000s successful and have real staying power. It's extremely difficult to create that circumstance on a GitHub based project. It's even worse on a GitLab based project, because these systems are are designed in such that you make it super easy for someone to say, I'm going to file an issue there and just kind of leave it be in whenever. But also, you can trivially fork, which again, before GitHub wasn't a term we would use what's the word for it, frivolously.
Hmm.
Yeah. So you would fork a project, make a change and submit it back. But the onus of reviewing that patch or that change was squarely on the maintainer of the project. In SourceForge ones, or in a lot of projects that have their own systems, uh, there was the opportunity for third parties to do reviews, to do feedback, to comment, to do triage, all these things. It took a while. GitHub has recently introduced some of this capability into the GitHub platform, but for much of its existence, it didn't have any of these things. And so culturally, we've regressed a little in how open source works. And I think this is one of the reasons why we often see people dreading, you know, stars or issues or pull requests on GitHub,
Yeah.
because the dynamic has changed so that it is a lot harder for someone to step up and become part of it's a lot harder for communities to properly form, because it's a lot harder to create a relationship where you have emotional attachment to a project. People don't think of projects as communities as so much anymore as they used to back then. And this is a very subtle difference, because if you look at it like, just from a mechanical point of view, like, sure, you can do all the same things on, say, Launchpad or SourceForge that you can do on GitHub or whatever, but the philosophy and the structure and the aim and the focus of the feature set and how the system actually works has had a huge negative impact on scaling projects, because now it promotes not being able to share the project with others. It promotes this burden, as a real accepted thing, and it was never supposed to be about that. Um, and indeed, a lot of the projects that I got involved with over the years started with me doing patch review as an uninvolved individual. I would comment and say, "Hey, this thing looks kind of wrong," or "I tried it with this thing and it didn't quite work the way I
Mm-hmm.
expected," that sort of thing. Um, GitHub kind of still supports this. It has a two-tier approach to third parties versus members of the project, but it kind of lets you do this. But GitLab takes this to the extreme. If you're not a member of the project, if you're not a maintainer of the project, you actually cannot do code review. You cannot do approvals. You cannot do any of those things, because it takes a much more enterprise, or very specific, very controlled way of project management versus GitHub, versus SourceForge, versus Allura, Fusion Forge, even Pagure, Fedora's Forge, um,
Mm-hmm.
is more community oriented than GitLab, or even to a lesser extent GitHub is. And this underlies the philosophical difference that has impacted us and has made it difficult for make projects to be sustainable, to make projects successful, and to make people feel like they can be invested and contribute and be involved even beyond just code and reviews, but like, triaging issues, making
Mm-hmm.
documentation, and all these things. These these are the pieces that we have lost in the effort to drive primacy towards code above all else, but to also drive primacy to the maintainer above all else. It
At the
also puts a
expense of
burden,
the maintainer's well-being and health, and
right, and at the expense of the community's health, if it was ever going to be one. We will never know what kind of damage that has done or what kind of success it has wrought. We don't know what would have happened if you would take GitHub out of the picture and put something else that had much more of a community focus. But what I do know is this has had an impact, and this is, I think, where, as I reflected earlier today, and I'm talking about this now, I think this is where a lot of the problems come from, is that we don't really have this whole, and I hate to use this trite phrase from days gone by, social coding, right? This was the slogan of GitHub for many years, but it was hardly very social, other than the discovery and the network effect.
mm-hmm.
Um, the social aspects of an open source project or a free software project just weren't there. They're just not emphasized in the design of systems like GitHub and GitLab, especially not GitLab, because GitLab is really more designed for enterprise corporate DevOps kind of stuff. And so it doesn't have that. It's of course possible to do this, and I think GitHub has started to recognize this. You see that they've recently added this discussions
D-
feature, and they're
yes.
looking at messaging and sponsors and all these things. That they're starting to figure it out, but I think they probably don't have the right. They're not thinking of it from like, let's take a step back and think about all the experiences people have had, especially all of it, the GitHubbers there. A lot of them actually come from a pre-GitHub era,
Mm-hmm.
and they have experienced these things. I don't think they've necessarily taken that step back and thought about what was different then and now, and what was good about then, and what is good about now, and what was bad about then, and what was bad about now, and try to fix that. Try to bring the best of back then with the best of now to make things even better. I don't want GitHub necessarily to just go poof. That I don't like that it's proprietary, but I also don't really want it to like just go poof, because that's not going to be helpful for anybody. But
No,
this is the sort
especially
of
since
thing.
that's where, yeah, especially those of us where that's where all of our repositories are. We definitely want
Yeah,
a little bit of warning.
sure, yeah. But like this is so I think a lot of what people are missing from now is this ability to think of projects as communities. We throw around the word community a lot, but if we sat down and thought about it, what is a community? It's a group of people coming together towards a single goal. Whether they be developers, testers, evangelists, uh, you
Hmm.
know, those sorts of people. But where do they all fit in the way that projects are typically managed today? In a lot of cases, they don't.
Yeah.
Like user communities aren't typically welcome on GitHub projects. Um, Testers and documentation folks, they don't really have a place in a lot of projects on GitHub,
We're
and you
trying to
don't
make
really
that
have.
happen.
Yeah, yeah, and you don't have an avenue for people to have free flowing discussion, async and sync. Like Gitter, actually, to its credit, is a great real time chat solution for a lot
Hmm.
of GitHub projects, but GitHub projects don't by default use them. There is no default way to do those kinds of
Hmm.
like ad hoc synchronous real-time communication. And then of course we've had no replacement for mailing lists for GitHub projects for most of the past decade. I'm kind of hoping that discussions can turn into a platform in which can serve the same role that mailing lists have, but I don't know. I don't know if that's what will happen. I hope it will. But like these are all the ingredients that you need to have a successful community. You need to have all these different people, and without that, it becomes hard for a community from a project to turn into a community.
Yeah.
And so projects tend to be groups of apathetic people who don't really care, or who have self-entitlement and just put pressures on everyone. Like this is the problem.
Yeah, and I think that you can have even with that when you get certain people who see the potential for a community there, who can use that energy and tools and a lot of stubbornness to help the powers that be kind of, make way for this better thing to happen. But it is interesting because it is all of those things. It's both the tools and their underlying philosophy. It's people and sometimes their clashing underlying philosophies. We have generational gaps. We have culture differences, and somehow we try to make this all work. And it's especially for someone that I'm old enough to have been using Linux for a while. I didn't get involved with it until 3, 4 years ago. So mailing lists are a thing that I do use, but not quite as much as other tools, like Slack and Discord. And so it's just, finding where can people meet in the middle on things, and to get that feeling of when you stop being that group of kind of apathetic, jaded, kind of burned individuals and get to a place where that kind of alchemy, kind of like when you joined Fedora and had somebody welcome you in and kind of and help you see that your contributions could make the project you use even better. And when you
Mm-hmm.
get those moments, I swear it's like magic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, and I think that we all want there to be less of a gap in between those moments and more kind of more support, whether it's from infrastructure or people, because you're right, otherwise, community just becomes kind of this next buzzword. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and
It already has in a lot of ways. Like if you see a lot of corporate driven, vendor driven projects say the word community for everything, and I'm not going to call out to any specific ones, but like you can come up with a few all on your own. Like there's a fair number of these where they, when they talk about community, they list people and put in the parentheses the companies that they work for. Right? That's when it's not a community. That's a bunch of people who just have to do it. And some of them may be passionate, but more likely than not, they're apathetic to the whole thing.
yeah. So, what are some of the ways that you've that I know that both in your role as a Fedora contributor and now as an OpenSUSE board member? Congratulations for more responsibility and still zero pay.
Yeah, well,
What are some of the things like, especially with one of those p- positions where kind of you kind of have a hand on the steering wheel there? What are some of the things that you're hoping for to kind of help encourage that sense of genuine community?
my goal with in Fedora and in OpenSUSE at the end of the day
Hmm.
is to try to enable people to be successful at supporting their own desires, needs, wants, ambitions within the scope of the projects. So, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do in Fedora is just do things to make the project better, to make the distribution better, to help other people who use Fedora Linux uh, on their systems to do things better, to help support the infrastructure teams, to help support the users and the communities around Fedora. And the same goes in OpenSUSE. Before I became a board member, I was also a member, and I still am a member of the OpenSUSE Heroes, which is the team that manages the OpenSUSE infrastructure. And over the past year or so, me and another member of the OpenSUSE Heroes have spent a good deal of time looking very closely at the infrastructure we have and thinking about the ways that we want to enable better workflows, enable better mentorship models, enable better contributorship models, these sorts of things. And so, like, we launched our own Pagger instance on code.opensuse.org. And the reason we did that was to give people a free-form way to host their own scripts, tools, projects, but also so that they can do their own self-organizing to do project management and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
So, like in Fedora, there's a concept of working groups and special interest groups and all these things. And these are self-organizing groups who come together who are passionate about a particular thing and try to enable it within the aegis of the Fedora project. That model has been so wildly successful in Fedora that it is generally known as the innovation engine in the Linux ecosystem. Like you see every Fedora release, the changes that are being made are listed out, and
Hmm.
Phoronix and Ars Technica and everybody reports on them, and they do that because we empower people to be proud of the work that they do, to show it
Hmm.
off to everyone else, to gather feedback to make it better, and to have each other support each other on implementing these things to make the world a better place. To be, to put it tritely, I guess. And I want to bring that same kind of thing into the OpenSUSE community because the Open SUSE community is full of very bright people who could do very amazing things. But the way that the project has been run for a long time has made it difficult for people to communicate effectively about these sorts of things, to organize effectively to make these things, and to support each other effectively to keep up with these things. And this has made, sadly, Open SUSE is not as well known as it was 20 years ago. SUSE used to be the distro everybody like watched out for, because Novell, when they first bought SUSE, they did a bunch of work into supporting the Linux desktop. They pushed us forward into compositing, GL, accelerated graphics, and all that sort of stuff, and they did a lot of effort into improving GNOME after Ubuntu stopped doing it quite so much, and then later Red Hat picked up the mantle from there on this. But today, SUSE is barely talked about. It is barely known, despite the fact that it quietly does amazing work and is very innovative and does things that makes bold decisions that nobody else would. And there's a lot to like about Open SUSE. But what there isn't, what there's less to like about is, how do you interact with that community, and how do you, do something in there? Because, historically, the project talks about this doocracy thing where, if you feel like there's something to do, you just go and do it. The catch-22 here is, if you don't know what to do, how can you start doing it?
How can you actually do anything?
Yeah. Right. And also, if you have an idea and you don't know how to approach it, it's really difficult because you don't know how to bring the idea up in a context in which people can supportively help you figure out how to do it. Like, these are all things that Fedora has done with the changes process, with FESCO existing as advisors to help support approving technical changes into the distribution. The mechanisms that exist in Fedora were created specifically to support this kind of community engagement. It was a very important goal when the Red Hatters that were working on building out the Fedora Linux distribution, the Fedora project, they wanted to make this a thing. And I want to take those lessons learned. I mean, I don't want to do everything exactly the same way Fedora did, but I want to take the lessons learned from there and try to apply them to make Open SUSE better. And so that's one of the reasons I ran for the board, is I wanted to bring this vision of making the Open SUSE community a real strong community in its own right, where its members can be proud of being part of Open SUSE, and that people recognize the achievements of Open SUSE as a community, as well as a Linux distribution, and all the things that they do. I want that kind of recognition for Open SUSE like Fedora has, because they deserve it.
Yeah. And all of the people I've known who have been associated with that project have been passionate and smart and kind, and so I hope that this bears fruit, and this time next year that you've made some incredible headway. So
I hope so too.
Yeah. Well, tell it. So, yes, I do too. So, tell us, if people listening to this video want to get in touch with you, what would be the best way?
The easiest way is basically through Twitter. Like, Twitter is my main communication mechanism to most of the world, and so you can reach me. I am I am DET_Conan_Kudo. It means Detective Conan Kudo. It's a reference to Detective Conan. And feel free to look it up. Cool anime. But yeah, so like I can be reached by Twitter. Of course, you can reach me by email, ngompa@fedoraproject.org, ngompa@opensuse.org. Those are, my project list email addresses. But really, Twitter's the best way to reach me. I tend to be fairly active there and keep track of this. I do have a Mastodon. That's for those who are kind of afraid of the Twitter. I do exist on Mastodon. I am Conan_Kudo at fossstodon.org.
Very
And
cool.
so I exist there as well.
And we will try to put all of these in the notes for this video. So,
Okay.
excellent. Well, thank you so much. It was great to hear your origin story and see and hear about just your history of engagement and contribution. And I really love to hear about kind of this vision that you have for the future. So it was a pleasure. So,
Oh.
yeah. So, anyway, and thank you also for being one of our guest curators. I remember the word that is time. So, thank you very much. And
Thank you.
excellent. And I am sure I will see you soon, either on Twitter. I know I've been like, wow, I really upped my involvement there.
Yeah.
Or in any of the like gazillion Linux associated Telegram groups that we're both in. So,
Yes. Yeah. So I'm in Telegram and Matrix as well. Yeah. So like I'm on Telegram, I'm on Matrix, I'm on Discord. It's easy enough to find me. Some variation of Conan Kudo
yeah,
is where I am.
it's pretty nice because you've got the same icon everywhere. So I'm like, yep, that's him.
It helps. It helps. That was intentional. I try to have some coherency between my identities.
It worked. So, anyway, Neal, thank you so much. All right.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
My pleasure.
Thank you. All right. Bye.